Hello and welcome to all our attendees. Thank you so much for joining us today. Criterion Edge is very excited to present our first of a two-part series webinar, How to Assess Your CER for MDR Readiness, State-of-the-Art, Safety and Performance Criteria, Equivalence, and Systematic Literature Review. We're joined today by our president, Lori Mitchell, who will be presenting on this topic. Lori Mitchell is founder and president of Criterion Edge, a global medical and regulatory writing and safety services firm serving the medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech industries. Lori has over 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety and pharmacovigilance management, and regulatory reporting. Having provided regulatory solutions to many pharma and medical device companies, both large and small, she is a proven leader in designing practical strategies to meet current global regulatory challenges. Lori is also a published author and holds a Master of Nursing from UCLA. Before we get started, I first want to run through a few housekeeping items. If you experience any technical difficulties, please send us a message through the chat option below on your screen, and we'll try to do our best to resolve it. If you have any questions about our content today, please type in your questions either in the chat or the Q&A option on the Zoom menu bar, and we'll try to run through as many of them as we can. If we are unable to answer your question in the duration of this webinar, we can get in touch with you afterwards to chat. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on demand afterwards.
Thank you, Jessica, and welcome everyone to this first presentation in a two-part series on assessing your CER for MDR readiness. In our session today, the information is presented from the point of view of seasoned CER medical writers. Over the last 4 years, our team has performed gap analyses on many poorly written CERs, and before too long, we began to detect common themes to those gaps. Excuse me. Today, I will present strategies gleaned from our experience for assessing critical components of your CER for possible misalignment with key MDR requirements. And we'll also talk about why organization, structure, and clear language really matter in a CER. This is a practical presentation, which hopefully will help you assess and thus mitigate your own CER processes and documents for possible gaps prior to submission to regulatory authorities. In this webinar, we will identify key review strategies to assess a CER for common gaps found in the state-of-the-art section, the safety and performance criteria, equivalence, and the systematic literature review methodology. But first, an important disclaimer from the Criterion Edge team. There's always a disclaimer, seems. The information presented in this webinar is based upon our experience writing many MedDev Rev 4 and MDR compliant CERs for notified body review. The opinions, tips, and best practices presented here are our interpretation and do not represent opinions or decisions that may be made by a notified body. The information is conceptual, such as each clinical evaluation process is unique to the subject device under evaluation. We hope you find the information useful and applicable to your own internal processes. Sincerely, the Criterion Edge team. Let's begin with a bird's eye view of the CER by broadly examining the purpose, methodology, and organization of the document. Is a purpose clearly stated, such as what is the objective and rationale for the clinical evaluation? For example, clearly state the CER is intended to establish conformity of all subject devices with relevant safety and performance requirements stated in the regulations applicable to your CER submission. Is methodology well documented and thorough throughout the CER? For example, are your planning activities described? Are all applicable regulations and internal SOPs listed? Is a justification for the device grouping clearly outlined? And very importantly, are all clinical data sets analyzed using the established safety and performance endpoints and acceptance criteria? The CER should be logically organized, That is, does it flow and tell the story? Are all data cut time ranges consistent? Sometimes in CERs we've reviewed, cross-referencing and use of supporting citations is not adequate. All supporting documentation should be clearly listed in the report. The goal is to ensure whatever is provided in the final document is valid in terms of the data presentations, the evaluation, analysis, and conclusions. Check the language and overall consistency throughout the document, that it makes sense and comes together to establish the safety and performance as intended for your state-of-the-art device. One tip is to place the state-of-the-art section at the beginning of the document, immediately following the executive summary and scope section. This sets the stage for the remainder of the clinical evaluation. The first section we'll review is the state-of-the-art section, which, in our opinion, is a critical foundational component to the CER, making it, in some ways, the most important section of the CER. And I want to break here for just a moment to say that I know we're all social distancing, and I know that we're all probably listening to this from home, and I am certainly presenting it from home. And I want to all introduce you to my office assistant, Kiki, the cat, who may weigh in from time to time with a comment in the background. So please ignore her. She's an unpaid volunteer. A well-written state-of-the-art should tell the story of the current knowledge and competitive landscape related to the subject device and its technology. It must clearly demonstrate that the subject device is a state-of-the-art treatment option by establishing the safety and performance endpoints and acceptance criteria to which the device under evaluation will be compared. The methodology of the state-of-the-art literature review should be clearly presented and focus only on the current knowledge and competitive landscape data. Be sure that analysis and conclusion statements are specific and unambiguous. Ensure that the story flows logically, beginning with a description of the clinical conditions related to all indications for the subject device, and I would also add all patient populations, and moving all the way through available treatment options and maturity of technology. Remember, device-specific, subject device-specific data does not belong in the state-of-the-art section. Presented here are some common observations noted in past CERs that we've updated to MDR compliance, and a few suggested revisions you should consider. For example, inadequate or missing discussion of current guidelines and maturity of technology. Another gap we commonly encounter is the state-of-the-art literature search and review methodology is not provided at all. The state-of-the-art section must focus on the description and analysis of the broad therapeutic and competitive landscape relevant to the subject device under evaluation. There may be little or no cross-referencing or linkage of the state-of-the-art information to other relevant CER sections. Another issue is the overall discussion and analysis of the state-of-the-art is poorly developed, lacking specificity and/or data support. Often we find there is no definitive conclusion statement that establishes the device as state-of-the-art. In fact, a lack of clear conclusion statements is a consistent finding in the gap analyses we've performed, affecting the not only the state-of-the-art, but also the equivalence section, the clinical data, and the risk sections of the CER. Again, try to state your conclusions and then state them again. The notified bodies that are reading these, those folks are likely tired. They've written a lot. They've read a lot. They may be skimming. So if you stated it somewhere, state it again, that you're concluding that that you've come to a certain conclusion, that your device is state-of-the-art, that your device is equivalent, whatever the conclusion statements are, it doesn't hurt to repeat yourself. Suggested revisions based on some of these observations could be to ensure that all required elements of the state-of-the-art are established in one comprehensive section of the CER rather than placed piecemeal across several unrelated sections. We have seen that before in other CERs we've evaluated, and it doesn't tell the story. The reader, in this case the notified body usually, has to skip around. So make sure it's all contained at the beginning of the CER and all in one large section. Current guidelines and maturity of technology related to the device under evaluation must be presented. Remember to conduct a separate state-of-the-art literature search and describe that methodology. Finally, substantiate conclusions on the state-of-the-art treatment option with safety and performance rates derived from competitive landscape literature analysis. Next, we'll review safety and performance criteria. The purpose of the safety and performance objectives, or endpoints as they're also called, is to establish key endpoint outcomes measurable by clearly stated acceptance criteria. Those criteria should be valid, relevant, and measurable, and cover all indications, as I've said before in the state-of-the-art that we just reviewed. The CER must document how they're justified and used as measures for evaluating safety and performance of the subject device. The methodology should cite applicable requirements such as GSPRs and describe the process used to establish those measurable safety and performance objectives and the criteria. Remember, safety and performance objectives and criteria must be based upon the competitive landscape data analyzed in the state-of-the-art section. Be sure to fully describe how those endpoints and criteria will be used to then evaluate the subject device's clinical data in the context of the state-of-the-art. For your reference, I've included here the text from GSPR1, which really underpins this whole discussion about endpoints, state-of-the-art endpoints, and acceptance criteria. This requirement has really been reinforced under MDR. The evaluation of the device must be performed within the context of the state-of-the-art, and specifically that there is an evaluation of the device's safety and performance objectives against quantitative acceptance criteria. The CER must explain how the endpoints and acceptance criteria are defined, how they are developed, and what the sources are. Ranges must be established, that is, the upper and lower bounds, where the lower bound is usually considered the minimally acceptable rate for the performance objectives, and the upper bound, the minimally acceptable rate for the safety objectives. In most cases, the state-of-the-art and competitor literature is used as the source to extract safety and performance acceptance criteria relevant to the current competitive landscape. And by the way, in some cases, certain performance acceptance criteria can be extrapolated based upon industry standards. Common observations that we've seen here are the safety and performance objectives or the criteria are missing altogether from the state-of-the-art analysis, or it's unclear how they were established. We've seen that there is no cross-referencing or linkage of the objectives to other relevant sections. And finally, there may be endpoint objectives established, but there is no analysis of the clinical data to demonstrate that those endpoints were met. Remember, these acceptance criterion endpoints are established in the state-of-the-art, and they then filter out throughout the rest of the analyses of the clinical data, whether that's PMS data, clinical literature, clinical evaluation, whatever the sources of your data, clinical data are, you need to re-engage with these safety and performance criteria and the acceptance criteria in each of those subsequent sections. Be sure to define at least 2 measurable safety and performance endpoints derived from the competitor landscape literature, and describe methodology and link the acceptance criteria to clinical outcomes described in the state-of-the-art section. And I say 2 here, I don't really mean that 2 is the right number. I think 1 is too few, and 5 endpoints, 6 or 7 may be too many. Just make sure that you establish multiple measurable safety and performance endpoints. And don't forget to document applicable GSPRs. Again, it's critical to analyze all clinical data sources against the endpoints and acceptance criteria. Lastly, it's important to note that information derived from published clinical case reports is considered a very low level of evidence and thus cannot be analyzed against established safety and performance acceptance criteria. Now let's review equivalence. You know, the purpose of an equivalence argument is singular and quite straightforward: to establish that the subject device under evaluation is fully equivalent to the comparator device. Of course, as you all know, the successful equivalence argument establishes that A equals B, and thus data from one can be used to support the safety and performance of the other. Methodology must show the head-to-head comparison of all clinical, technical, and biological, or CTB, characteristics. It should be presented in tabular format. There should be unambiguous comparison of each characteristic and a clear justification why any difference is is valid or acceptable. Lastly, in a step that's too frequently overlooked, be sure to clearly state the conclusion of the equivalence analysis. Organize the equivalence section by presenting all CTB characteristics, as I said, in an easy-to-follow table. Assess each characteristic as same or similar, and perform a gap analysis of the differences. In summary, for CERs that involve equivalence, the focus should be on the gap analysis, all differences justified, and conclusions clearly stated. Common observations in equivalence is that there are unclear or incomplete equivalence arguments or justifications. Supporting equivalence data or test results are missing, or there is inadequate cross-referencing to internal source documentation. Justification and analysis must be present for each CTB characteristic that is not the same, and the impact of the differences on safety and performance must be based on device documentation or data. Don't forget to include information such as the equivalent comparator name, manufacturer, class, technical documentation, reports, descriptions, and images. This is just to make sure that it's very clear that there is a full description of the equivalent comparator. Develop clear, unambiguous comparison tables and address each variant. And don't forget to summarize and conclude. Each characteristic variant must have a justification and analysis why the difference is still valid or acceptable.
Last on our list today is a discussion on how to conduct and present a strong, methodologically robust, systematic literature review process. The purpose here is to document the clear and methodologically robust process for the identification, retrieval, selection, appraisal, and weighting of published clinical data. The methodology must be transparent and reproducible, minimize bias, and be fully documented. Be sure not to commingle the methodology and results from the state-of-the-art and your competitive landscape searches with the subject device searches. Those should be separated, clearly separated in your CER, and be documented that they were separate searches. Ensure all required documentation is clearly organized and explained, and to prevent unnecessary clutter in your CER, present those lengthy tables, such as the excluded articles table, as appendices. Here, the observations are all based that we've found in the past, are all based really around one theme: unclear and inadequate documentation of methodology. Methodologies such as the literature search, the time range of the literature searches, literature exclusion, literature screening criteria, or I'm sorry, exclusion criteria, and the next is the screening criteria. Inadequate or unclear methodology or documentation of your clinic, how you extracted clinical data, and the clinical data presentation and analysis. Suggested revisions based upon these findings is to document. And again, it's no surprise that if there's unclear methodology, you need to do a better job of documentation and in your process flow. So be sure to document your search, screening, and data collection methodology. Separate those subject device and PICO searches from the comparator device and state-of-the-art searches. The full search strategy for each literature search conducted should be included. All exclusion criteria used in the search, such as animal studies, non-systematic reviews, conference abstracts, those should be clearly demonstrated or clearly presented. And to document all excluded articles and the reason for exclusion at the study level. And of course, the weighting and appraisal methodology. This brings us to the conclusion of this presentation. I hope that the information and opinions presented here have been useful to you. So in conclusion, I would like to leave you with a few final thoughts. Consider the following. If the subject device and its technology is not established as a state-of-the-art treatment option, it is impossible to compare its safety and performance outcomes from other clinical data sources to the competitive landscape GSPR benchmarks that you established in the state-of-the-art section. You can't make that linkage. If equivalence between competitor and subject devices is not established, it is impossible to use comparator clinical data to support the safety and performance of the subject device. And finally, if the literature search, screening, and review methodology is not rigorous, methodologically sound, and clearly documented, the validity of the clinical data itself may be called into question. And with that, I will turn it back to Jessica.
Thank you, Lori. We hope at this point you do have a clear understanding of the key MDR requirements applicable to each CER section, the steps to apply review strategies for assessing your CER for alignment, and finally, how clarity of structure and organization are critical to your CER. If not, this is the time to send in your questions. I'll give you guys maybe a couple more seconds to type in your questions. You can use the Q&A option below or the chat option to send your questions. And I see that we have a few already. So Lori, if you're ready, I can start sending them over to you.
Can you read them out loud, Jessica?
Yes, I will. So one of our questions here is, what will be still applicable for UTMed after MDR has been postponed to 2021?
What will be applicable?
What will be still applicable for UTMed after MDR has been postponed to 2021?
I believe that there will be no changes in applicability to any of these once the EU MDR, I'm not sure I understand the question, once MDR becomes fully enforced now in May of 2021, then there will be no changes to what we have been talking about today. And of course, I think we've all been preparing on this, many of you have been preparing all along for the, the magic date of in less than a month from now. And then we got this reprieve for 1 year. So many of our clients are really talking about two things. I'll kind of range a little bit afield from the question to say that many of our clients are telling us two things. Is they'll say, we're forging ahead with our MDR plans for all of our devices, or their regulatory strategy has changed, and that some of the devices they are now submitting in consultation with their notified bodies, I'm sure, they're submitting under MDD. And of course, we as their outsourced vendor for clinical writing and clinical evaluation, we're not involved in those internal strategic discussions, but some of our clients have changed. A couple of the CERs that we were engaged to write as MDR CERs, they've changed them to MDD, given that we've got now a time frame of an additional year. So I hope that answered the question.
Thanks, Lori. We have another one here from Elizabeth. Is it acceptable to exclude articles not written in English from the literature search?
Yes, that's a great question, and I'll say that we've been doing this for a long time. Really, Criterion Edge began right in late 2016 and very early 2017, just as MedDev Rev 3 was revving to Rev 4. And that question came up a lot then, which is, does the manufacturer have a responsibility to translate articles? And again, in our opinion and in our experience, we have found that not to be true, that there's never been any pushback on any of the feedback that we've gotten through our clients on regulatory, on notified body feedback saying you should have translated articles. So I'm going to say in our experience, that's a no. We have commonly excluded non-English articles from our search, in our search criteria for quite a while now.
Okay, thanks, Lori. Here's a question from Jan. When a manufacturer determines that the demonstration of conformity with general safety and performance required based on clinical data is not deemed appropriate, is it still necessary to look for an equivalent device?
I want to be careful about questions like that, because that feels like a regulatory strategy type of question. It sounds like the question is, we evaluated our CER with our subject device with what the data that we had available, and it came up inadequate. That's what it sounds like the question may be surrounding. So what do we do then? Well, it's back to the drawing board. The end of the day, the notified bodies deem whether or not GSPRs that are established in the CER, that there's adequate clinical data to demonstrate safety and performance of the device. And if that data is not those data are not present, then you may need to look for more ways of accessing data on your device.
Okay, thanks, Lori. Someone's asked here, can case studies be included anywhere in the CER, or should they just be excluded?
There are cases in which we do use and do find some value in including case reports as included in the clinical literature. The comment that I made that that they can't be used necessarily to establish the safety and performance of your device, certainly solely, I think is a true statement. But there are cases in which case reports may show some adverse events or some other types of information that is relevant to the clinical device. So while they're not used heavily, there may be cases in which they can be used as part of your strategy.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here about also about case studies. So I think it might be relevant to ask this. Can case studies or case series, which are slightly better quality than case reports, be used to establish safety and performance endpoints? If yes, what number of cases in the case series or case studies would be considered acceptable?
They can't, again, case data derived from case reports and case studies is not statistically analyzed, and is therefore doesn't rise to the bar of the same statistical analysis that retrospective or prospective reviews, or certainly RCT data is. So this has to do with the level of evidence that's included in the case reports, and therefore, you know, while again you can include some of that in there, you really can't. You should avoid that where at all possible.
All right. Let's see. Here's one on something about the state of the art. Is it possible to use the data from the state of the art search in the literature as clinical data for our device under evaluation in CER?
The state of the art is meant to assess the landscape, the therapeutic landscape, if you will, in which your device and its technology exists. So unless your device and its technology is extremely unique, it has company in that therapeutic landscape, competitors essentially. And it is the job of the state-of-the-art section to tell the story about what that maturity of technology is and how it developed, and ultimately to take you to the end of the story, which is the description of the therapeutic landscape and the technology in which your device exists. So your device has other competitors, and you now need to establish in that competitive landscape the safety and performance of these key endpoints that you've derived from either your own internal trials and data that you have conducted and performed, and also what is demonstrated in your state-of-the-art analysis in the competitor, in the literature itself. What you can't do is you can't use your own data on your own device to establish your own safety and performance state-of-the-art criteria. You can't do that. What we have done is that we use competitor devices data and pooled meta-analyses and systematic literature review of pooled data sets in which your device may be present in there, but is also present with all of its other competitors. So I hope that helped to answer the question. You can't present specifically your own device data in the state-of-the-art section, but you can use systematic literature reviews and other sources of pooled and meta-analysis data in which your device may be included to establish the overall safety and performance criteria and acceptance, upper and lower bounds of acceptance criteria for the state-of-the-art. I hope that helped answer that, clarify that question.
Great, thanks, Lori. We have another one here from Eric. When establishing equivalence, the MDR indicates that the manufacturer is supposed to have agreements in place with the manufacturer of the equivalent device and access to reports and data. How have you handled this, especially since getting an agreement between competitors to share data will never happen?
I can answer that question honestly and very clearly. We, again, as an outsourced vendor to manufacturers, have actually never had a client, and we've written a lot of CERs. So I hate to leave you hanging there, Eric, but we've never had an instance that we've worked with a client of ours in which that type of agreement is in place. So we haven't ever handled those negotiations. Theoretically, if those negotiations are in place, then the whole point of that contract and those agreements is that the manufacturer that you are I'm sorry, I'm distracted by something. The manufacturer that you're agreeing with, the agreement says that they will hand over all relevant technical documentation and data. That's the whole point of that. If that agreement says that, then you should be able to handle that data just as if that data was held by the manufacturer itself.
Okay. I'll keep going, Lori. There's so many questions that have come in.
Sure.
We have a little more time. We can continue. How do you establish the safety and performance acceptability criteria for ancillary devices, class 1 to A?
That's a complicated, and again, I know that this forum isn't good for detailed kinds of answers to questions, and we can certainly discuss with this person offline any kind of, if they wanted to have a call with us to kind of talk about that. But in general, it is more difficult. That is for sure. And there are ways. I can use an example of, let me use an example of guide wires, for example, coronary and peripheral guide wires, of which we've written many CERs for those. And perhaps many of you on the call have a device like that, which means that it's an ancillary device to a procedure or a treatment, and which is not often, and that as such, as an ancillary device, there are not a lot of direct articles written up in clinical literature analyzing that ancillary device. But what we have, the approach we've taken successfully in conjunction with our clients, of course, is to take the approach of, again, with a guide wire. A guide wire, if there is overall procedure success in which our guide wire was used, that you can extrapolate from that the guide wire worked successfully. If AEs such that are often related to guide wire use, which is, say, vessel dissection or perforation, or inability to cross a lesion, again, those are ancillary safety and performance criteria that could be extrapolated or related to the performance of the guide wire. So I hope that helps. It is a somewhat of a complex discussion, but there are ways to tackle it without successfully, and use clear data to document that.
Okay. Somebody's asked, how important is it to stick to the format described in MedDev 2.71 version 4? How much freedom is there to organize your CER differently from what is described in the guidance?
Well, I'll answer that question carefully by saying that the guidance is there, I think, for a reason, and that it is meant to be used, very, very specifically. However, certainly, every manufacturer has their own templates and has their own way of tackling a CER. And I think that's why I said throughout this presentation is that the CER should tell a story, and it should tell a story logically. And I believe I even said at the beginning is that we believe, and we often see in our CERs that we evaluate, that the state-of-the-art section should come at the beginning because it sets the stage for the rest of the story. And then whether you put the device description next or you put it at the end, but we then generally proceed, and many of our clients proceed with the executive summary, the scope, the state-of-the-art section, and then we proceed through the analyses of the clinical data sources, which is essentially clinical literature, PMS, clinical investigations, and then move on to risk, and then finally conclude at the end. So how much freedom is there? I believe there's freedom. However, you don't want to flummox your notified body because your template is unique. And you may understand it, but at the end of the day, you really want your notified body to understand it as well.
Okay, thanks, Lori. Pamela asks, regarding equivalence, is it necessary for established devices? Our devices do have competitors, but we do not have agreements with them that would allow us to adequately claim evidence.
Equivalence, you mean? Claim equivalence?
Equivalence, I'm sorry.
If equivalence is only necessary in a CER when the manufacturer believes there is not adequate data to establish the clinical data to establish the safety and performance of their device. So that's really the answer, which is that there's no reason to establish equivalence if you believe there is enough published data on your device and manufacturer held data on it, including PMCF data and PMS data. So I'm not sure why you would do equivalence when there is no need at the end of the day. So that is an early on strategic discussion to have internally with your team, which is, what do we think is out there? Do those data cover all of the indications and of the subject device or devices? If you have a product family of devices in which there may be, let's just use guide wires again, that there are 4 established product family of guide wires, and yet in the ensuing year, you as a manufacturer have developed another one, and that 5th one is being included in the product family for the first time. There would be guide wire number 5 is going to need to be analyzed for equivalence against the other 4. So if there's a new device that's been introduced into a product family, you do have to do equivalence for that new device against its, but you hold you are the manufacturer of all the other equivalent comparators, so no issue there.
Okay, thanks. We have another question here. Can CER for accessories be combined with the CER of a primary device? And if yes, what should be taken care of to prove the safety and performance of the accessory?
That's getting into, again, and I hate to cop out on all these questions, but I want to be really careful and make sure that we clearly communicate to you, our audience, that we're not, we don't do strategy discussions. The accessories can be included or referenced within a CER, especially if the only when, and data on those accessories can be used in the CER, but only when those accessories are used only with the subject device under evaluation. For example, a particular wand head or something for a system. If it's only used with that CER, with that subject device, then it's acceptable to put that accessory right in there with the CER. So be careful though, if the accessory can be used across multiple devices, then they must be, the accessories then must be evaluated within their own CER.
Okay, thanks, Lori. Rosalind asks if there is a set template we need to use for MDR CER.
Well, that, you know, that gets back to the question of the MDR-4 CER and what kind of template should be used. It's not so much that that MDR requires its own template, separate from an MDD type of CER. There are some differences. I'm not saying that they're identical. Those templates are identical, but for the most part, they are extremely similar. Most of the MDR changes that you see within an MDR CER have to do with language and approach and analysis. It's not that the MDR CER has different sections than an MDD CER, so much as there's a different approach, and there's different language and different requirements set out in the establishment of safety and performance of under MDR versus MDD. So no, you don't need a separate template, but you probably should look at your template, and that's what I mean. And I mean a template on its most high level scale. Certainly within each subsection, there may be differences between an MDD and an MDR in as far as the analysis and discussion and the type of data that you provide.
Okay. Afreen has asked, are we free to use any search terms such as name of benchmark product to extract safety and performance data?
In the literature searches for the state-of-the-art, you would be using in the state-of-the-art literature searches where you're now assessing the competitor landscape in which your device occupies. Those PICO searches, you know, patient or performant, patient and indication and comparator and outcome. Those PICO searches are combined with or sit alongside competitor searches only. So in other words, we may do a competitor search of clinical outcomes for the top several competitor names of the subject device that's under evaluation. So the subject device under evaluation is X, but its competitor names are A, B, C, and D. We will do a literature search looking for data on A, B, C, and D and exclude subject device X from that because we don't want to commingle those data. And then that competitor search is then used to help, and the data derived from, clinical data derived from the analysis of devices A, B, C, and D help to set the safety and performance and acceptance criteria in the state-of-the-art of the therapeutic landscape. Again, excluding your own subject device data specifically, unless it is part of pooled meta-analysis data or systematic reviews.
All right, and on the topic of literature searches, do you feel a medical librarian is required to perform literature searches for CERs?
Yes, we do. That's because, or someone who's very good, or someone who's very good at using mesh terminology and has performed complex and focused searches on platforms that are not PubMed, but Embase and Medline. We've been seeing in some of the reviews that we've done, and certainly in language in both MDR-rev4, not so much in MDR, that the EU actually calls out databases such as Medline and Embase. So doing a PubMed search is limited, and you need access to those other databases. If you have access to those databases, and as a company, and you have someone who is good at using mesh terminology and putting together search strings and search protocols and strategies, sure, you don't need a medical librarian. It's just that most of us don't have that. We do not, and we do not personally. That's why we have hired a medical librarian to do our searches, and we have an entire dedicated team of search and screening and QC folks that do our literature screening and QC, along with our medical librarian that sits on staff with us.
Thanks, Lori. We have a couple more minutes, so I'll just ask a few more questions. When updating a CER post-approval with new search data, how do you delineate between the new searches covering the latest time period, annual in our case, with the old search outputs?
Right. That's a constant theme that we do, and here's the easy answer and the not so easy answer. The easy answer is if the former searches were done in a robust methodology. Let's just say that the last time your CER had a CER was done, it was an MDD CER, and it was written in, let's just say, June of 2019. Let's just say that. And now here it is a year later, and you want to update that. And the June of 2019's literature search went back 3 years, let's say, from 2016 to 2019. Now, a year later, you want to submit that CER as an MDR CER, and the time frames that we're always seeing is a minimum of 5 years. So now you have to go back, even beyond, further back than last year's CER time frame. In that case, it's much easier. It really is much easier to just start your search from scratch. It's likely that your methodology from last year may not be as robust as it needs to be now. And so sometimes it's cleaner to start from the beginning and just do the whole thing from scratch. However, there are also things called bridge searches that we do all the time, where the methodology, and this is often for us with repeat clients. We have many clients that we've written their CERs over a number of years. And so it was our methodology a year ago that we used. And then in that case, if the total time frame is adequate, in other words, that 5-year mark, and you really only need to do a bridge search of 6 months or perhaps 1 year, you can certainly do that, and then marry all of the findings together and present all of those data from the old search and the bridged search into one analysis.
Okay. Yuval asks, and maybe we'll restrict us to maybe another 1 or 2 questions, Lori, before we close out.
Sure.
Does the safety and performance data need to support all indications of the device, or can you support the general intended use?
All indications of the device, not just the intended use. An example of that would be the intended use of a guide wire is to, basically is to cross a lesion in the peripheral and coronary vasculature. Then the intended use is to cross a lesion, more or less. And I'm simplifying this. I know everyone out there, the bells are going off because you think I'm making this too simple, and I probably am. But the intended use is not a specific enough statement. It's too broad. The intended use in what patient populations? Pediatric, adult, coronary, peripheral, cerebral vasculature, not cerebral vasculature. You had better be very specific and cover all of those possibilities. and patient populations.
All right. How many literature databases do you normally use for your literature searches, and which ones would you recommend most?
In our experience, with the CERs that we've written for different types of manufacturers, from cardiac, orthopedic, on and on, many different, in other words, from many different viewpoints, Embase and Medline have been always accepted, and there have been no questions that have come back from either the client or ultimately the notified body about using those. With that said, if you have a very unique type of technology that you know some data and clinical articles may be in a very specific database, you should go look there. In case it doesn't, might be very esoteric and perhaps not even show up on Embase and Medline, which of course you can check, you know, websites, and you can check many things through Embase and Medline. But if there are specific databases that you feel strongly that you need to search, you should do that as well, depending on your technology.
Great, thanks, Lori, and thank you guys for all your questions. There are still so many more that we haven't quite gotten to, but we are running out of time. So if we missed your question, we'll try to reach out to you after the webinar. Before you guys close out, we'd like for you to just quickly take a moment to answer our poll again. We want to know how you feel now that you've been through this webinar. How confident are you now in your processes and the readiness of the CER for MDR compliance? We'd love to just hear your thoughts. Give you guys a couple seconds to do that. And thank you everyone for your responses. Wonderful. A few more seconds. Looks like most of you are finishing up here. We will have a second part of this webinar coming up in July. So if you enjoyed the content you had seen today, Lori will come back and talk more about some of the rest of that content again, and with some new topics. So look out for that information. Thank you, guys. It looks like a lot of you did find this helpful, can also use more help. So we'll certainly answer some of your questions that we haven't gotten to today. So you can look out to hear from us. I just want to thank you again. Thank you, Lori, and thank you to all our attendees for joining. If you're interested in learning more about this, or if we haven't gotten to your question or you need to talk to us, please reach out to us at consult@criterionedge.com. This webinar is recorded and will be available shortly after. I want to thank you again for joining us. Have a wonderful day and please stay safe.